الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان اليوم الدين أما بعد. So apparently I'm the last person in the categories. Is this some purpose of Sheikh because I'm Ḥanbalī? Just out of curiosity, I'm just wondering. But no, thank you for sticking behind. Unfortunately, subhanAllah, the Ḥanbalī school of thought has the least people interested in for some odd reason. But put it this way, we're rare specimens, so it makes us inshallah very valuable. But the other thing is, because of that, a lot of people's impression of the Ḥanbalī school is not exactly as it appears. There's a lot of misconceptions. I face that including with my, is this recorded, Sheikh? A relative of mine, without naming names, before I get in trouble. Obviously elder, mashallah, may Allah bless her. But this is a common thing you always hear about, especially if you're from Egypt. And we were she was saying something and I was responding regarding something else, and she got frustrated, right? So she said, go, you're Ḥanbalī, right? But she meant is in a strict way. So the impression is in people's mind, usually in a strict position or stance, is the Ḥanbalī school of thought. But in reality, that is far from what it really is, right? And as we go through this inshallah towards the end, you should, at least by the end of this talk, you should realize that every school of thought has its strengths, right, and has its benefits. And not everything in it is strict or lenient or relaxed or any of that, right? There are certain things in certain schools of thought, they're pretty strict, others they're lenient. And so that's how it is, because it's all based on how they deduce their rulings, their principles, walking in the footsteps of the originators of schools of thought, the pious predecessors that discuss this field of study and so forth. So that being said, I guess the talk is Legacy of Baghdād. Now, the way I'm going to divide this talk, unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here early in time, but the way I'm dividing it is roughly, I kind of changed a little bit things. But I'm talking about the roots of the roots of the school, right? So we're talking about foundations, origins, and stages of development. This is some of these divisions of stages as they go through. They're arbitrary throughout the years, so don't take it into heart if you read other books and they tell you, no, that year is not the right cutoff. It's just more of a classification to help introduce people to the school of thought. And then I'm going to talk about the second portion of it regarding the usul of the madhhab, or actually we'll go with the notable scholars of the school of thought. And I purposely want to mention that is because you'll start noticing some names that you never thought were Ḥanbalī scholars, but also connects to the establishment and later settlement of the school of thought. When we go into the principles of the madhhab, some of the books relied upon in the end, and then the contribution in the madhhab in terms of the areas where it actually transitioned. So it did start in Baghdād, but it transitioned as being places or harbors of the majority of Ḥanbalīs in certain times in different areas. And then inshallah we're going to end by some of the historical problem solving. I'm not going to go into detail of this, but I'm going to end with how or why the Ḥanbalī school of thought is important in terms of what it brings from usul, flexibility that can still be used until this day to figure out problems. Now I have to ask, did any speaker, Sheikh, did this happen to you, Sheikh? Am I speaking too low? Do I need to yell? Do I need to because I usually get complaints from my masjid that I'm too, I need to project. But I feel I hear it in my ear, so I don't know if this is, so everybody can hear me clearly. At the back, ya Sheikh, can you hear me clearly? Excellent, alhamdulillah. Good to go. So we're going to start with the roots of the school of thought, right? And it's kind of where it moved from. And I obviously have to give a quick biography as much as I can of Imām Aḥmad ibn Ḥanbal, who is obviously the founder of, or the founder figure of the Ḥanbalī school of thought. And Imām Aḥmad ibn Ḥanbal was born in the year 164 and died in 164, died 241, right? He was born in Baghdād, right? And Imām Aḥmad ibn Ḥanbal, his name is Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Ḥanbal al-Shaybani, and he is from the tribe of, Bani Shaybani is from the tribe of Bani Bakr ibn Wa'il, which are the offsprings of Asad ibn Rabi' ibn Nizar ibn Ma'id ibn Adnan. Does that sound familiar? All right. So why does it sound familiar? Yes. Good. Part of Prophetic lineage. So the lineage of Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal meets with the lineage of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam at Nizar ibn Ma'ad ibn Adnan. All right. So it just kind of usually kind of mentioned because it is a tradition to for scholars to kind of address their lineage, where they come from, and so forth. That's why we mentioned it. But Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal rahimahullah, he was born in Rabi' al-Awwal, and interesting enough, he also died in Rabi' al-Awwal, and he also was an orphan. Right? It's kind of interesting some of the parallels that you see, right, of some of these scholars. But I think if I'm not mistaken, at least 3 of the schools of thought, their imams were orphans also, right? Like Imam Muhammad ibn Shafi'i was also a Muttalibi from the household of the Prophet ﷺ, and he was also an orphan. Imam Malik was an orphan. I don't think Abu Hanifa was in Nu'man, he was not an orphan. But I'm just kind of interesting, subhanAllah, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides for some people and gives them blessings from Him that they go above and beyond what sometimes we think is something that is in their disadvantage. طيب, Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal rahimahullah, when he's born in Rabi' al-Awwal in the year 164 in Baghdad, right? And at that time, Baghdad was considered the hub of scholarship because of the Khilafah was moved there, and so many of the scholars were in that area. A year after he was born, his father had died because he was a soldier, and he had died unfortunately, but his mom took care of him. Now, one of the things about Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal rahimahullah is that since he was a child, he had inherent piety in him, an inherent fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the stories that show this is that his uncle, who would write letters about other people to the Sultan, right? In Arabic it's called wishaya. Wishaya is tattletaling, okay? Like somebody sees something, you write it down, you send it to the Sultan. And so the uncle of Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, he had something, was sending a message, and told Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal to go and report it or hand it in. A few days later or a few weeks later, his uncle left and he came back and he asked him, and he said, "Did you deliver it?" He said, "No." Right? And so when he asked him, he asked him why, he said, "I wouldn't hand this report, right? And I actually threw it in the sea, I threw it in the river, right, or in the water body." And so his uncle replied, he said, "This little boy fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much because Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal did not want to commit some sort of sin, even as a child, to do something that would harm other people, things that were considered a form of tajassus, right, prying into other people's affairs unrightly." But this tells you from a younger age, Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal had that inclination. But also when he started as a young child, and he went to the regular madrasa or maktab program that they had. Essentially, he memorized the Quran, and he was skillful in many of the other subjects. Once he finished his primary studies, this is when he started his seeking of knowledge at that time. And he started attending the circles at a higher level. Now, interestingly, when he started learning fiqh, he started with Hanafi fiqh. All right. So one of his teachers was Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf. Right. Qadi Abu Yusuf rahimahullah was one of his teachers. And I sometimes mention these things purposely because although I did have a slide, but I'm not gonna. There's no point of showing it. But it beautifully shows how all schools of thought are interconnected one way or another, right? Through pollination from other scholars, from learning, whether it is the Hanafi school, Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani when he studied Imam Malik. We have over Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, he studied from fiqh, al-fiqh al-Hanafi. Imam Shafi'i, he studied with Imam Malik, but then he also went to Iraq and he studied with Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani, and then Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal studied with Imam Shafi'i, so forth, right? They are connected, but it also tells you, even though they're connected, they are also independent in their ijtihad. They have their different usul. And so no one can claim one is a byproduct of the other per se, or that one is, let's say, an older opinion of the other, or whatever the case is. No, these are independent scholars that reach the level of ijtihad because of their own principles that they deduced. They felt that this is the way to deduce legislation in Islam. So he studied with Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah for a few years, and he started when he was at the age of 12 approximately, so he was pretty young. At the age of 16, he decided to transition more into hadith, right? This is when he, the whole aspect of hadith became very appealing to Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, and he studied, he studied with several of the other scholars, and so he started, I apologize, from 12 to 16, or around the age of 16, and then afterwards he met Hushaym ibn Bashir, and he actually started traveling, but he spent some time with Hushaym ibn Bashir for quite a few years. At the age of 22, after he finished all the hadith in Iraq and studied with all the students there, or the teachers there, he actually started to travel. Now, out of all the many of the scholars, Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal was known for his travels. Right, he would travel from one country to the other to gather, hadiths and so forth. And so he went to Iraq. Obviously, he was in Iraq, but I'm not talking about, so I'm talking about Kufa and Basra within Iraq, not just Baghdad. So he started in Baghdad, but also went to Kufa and Iraq. He went to, the Arabian Peninsula, mainly the Hijaz. We're talking about Mecca. We're talking about Medina. He also went to the lands of the Hijaz, and then he also went south to Yemen to study with some of the famous scholars, whether this Abd al-Razzaq, rahimahullah, and then he also went to Syria. He also went to Syria. Now I have to yell at Sheikh. All right, and he also went to travel to Syria. But the whole point is to mention that he spent years traveling, right? And his focus was traveling since the age of 22, and he continued to seek knowledge, and he never sat to teach or give fatwa until he was the age of 40, right? By then, Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal was very well versed in several fields, right? Whether it was in hadith and its sciences, whether any part of his sciences, whether it's tasheeh, tad'if, the men, all these things, rulings on his own, whether it was fiqh, whether it's the Arabic language, right? Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, by the way, he spoke two languages, but he was very proficient in the Arabic language, proficient in tafsir, proficient in different modes of recitation even. Like he chose his own mode of recitation that he depended on. And then he also was very well versed in aspects of nasakh, mansukh, abrogations. But I'm just mentioning this so you can understand some of the statements that his teachers later on mentioned about him, right? Why are they saying this? And some of the students of those teachers were like, why are you overpraising, Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal? Because to them, all these other scholars, whether it's Abu Hanifa, whether Imam Malik or Imam Shafi'i, they came way ahead and they were more famous than Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal until later on, right? When Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, through his tribulation, he became to be known later on as Imam Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. It was then that people started, wanting to go to Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, wanting to his hadith, wanting to learn from his fiqh. But until then, subhanAllah, when the students of those teachers encountered him, why are you praising him? He's much younger than you, or you're better. But whatever the case is, this is the reality. But I understand why, this happened. So essentially later on, obviously in his life, he became to be known as Imam Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is more associated with theology, right? And many of the scholars later on, when they wanted to affirm that they are upon Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they would say, I follow Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, for example, right? Or his statements and so forth. Now, once again, he did not sit for ifta until he was 40 years old, and this is when he started to give his fatwa. Now, because he traveled a lot, he had many teachers, right? They're in the hundreds, whether it doesn't matter what field it was. And I had mentioned already, Qadi Abu Yusuf as one of them, Imam Shafi'i as one of them, and Hushaym bin Bashir already mentioned that. But some of the other ones who are also popular are Imam Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Imam Yazid ibn Harun, Al-Wakil ibn Jarrah, Sheikh Abd al-Razzaq, rahimahullah. And so all those are some of just a few of should be considered some of the famous scholars. Now, because of who Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal was, whether in fiqh or whatever field it was, especially in hadith, he also had a lot of students that came to seek hadith from Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal. Notably among them is Imam Muhammad al-Mardawi, right? Al-Hasan ibn al-Mardawi, Abu Bakr al-Athram, Imam, Salih, the child of Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, or also Abdullah ibn Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, and Ibn Ḥanbal himself, his cousin, were all students. And I mentioned those three because those are the ones that propagated the lineage or scholarship of Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, including some of his students. Now, some of the more notable, or people that might know that were students of Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal was the Imam Abi Dawud. Imam Dawud Sijistani was actually one of the students of Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, and in fact, he has a book of Masail Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal. Some of the questions he had asked Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, and he documented, and it's also printed. We have a print of it. One of the other notable scholars that we should also know is the Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah, Imam Muslim also, and Imam al-Tirmidhi, right? All those were students of Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, especially if you're talking about the science of hadith. Now, I'm just going to mention quickly, because we're talking about Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, so you can understand his status in the eyesight of some of the scholars, right? So I'm going to mention quotes from some of the scholars. I'm not going to do all of them, but some of them. So Imam Abd al-Razzaq al-San'ani, and I had mentioned earlier, he was a scholar of Yemen. Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal went and traveled to study with him. He said there were 4 who journeyed to me from Iraq. Right, so he mentioned there's 4 scholars, 4 students that journeyed from Iraq, and they are the heads in the field of hadith. And so he mentioned Ash-Shadukhani, Abu Ayyub, Sulaiman ibn Dawood, and then he said he was the best in memorizing hadith. And then Al-Madini, he said he was the most knowledgeable concerning differing in hadith. Ibn Ma'in, and he said he was the most knowledgeable concerning rijal, so the men, it's like knowing how weak they are, how strong they are, and so forth. And then he said, and Ahmed ibn Ḥanbal, he gathered all that which was mentioned before. So he's essentially what he's trying to say is that Ahmed ibn Ḥanbal, rahimahullah, he was in the highest level in memorization, highest level of understanding the differences between the narrations of hadith, in the highest level of understanding the narrators himself. And so he was a very capable scholar in that field by the judgment of his own teacher. Imam Abu Zur al-Razi, right? Do you guys know who Imam al-Razi is? I hopefully you do, right? I hope you guys do. But he is one of the great scholars of hadith also. So he had mentioned to Abdullah ibn Imam Ahmad himself, right? So this is the son of Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal. He had mentioned, he said Ahmed ibn Ḥanbal had memorized 1,000,000 hadith. Okay? So I don't want you to kind of misunderstand. Over here in the terminology of hadith, it's talking about the chains. Okay? So it could be one hadith, for example, and it has 20 chains. In their perspective, that's 20 hadiths. Okay? So he's saying that Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal had memorized 1,000,000 hadith, more referring to 1,000,000 chains, not necessarily the text itself, right? The statement itself. And that obviously included statements of the Prophet ﷺ, but many of the statements of the companions radiallahu anhum, the Prophet, Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, rahimahullah, he had memorized them. But Abdullah ibn Ahmad, he asked Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, he's like, how do you know? How do you know he memorized 1,000,000 hadith? And so Abu Zur'a, he said, I mentioned to him chapter headings. So they were studying together essentially, and he would mention chapter headings, right? The chapter of whatever, al-witr, right? Or qiyam al-layl. And he said, he said your father, right, would start listing all the hadiths with the chains in that chapter. And they spent the entire night doing this. And so as he's doing this, Imam al-Razi, rahimahullah, he was just kind of roughly calculating what he's saying, right? Imam ibn Ḥanbal. Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, himself, he said, I left Baghdad and I did not leave behind me anyone more virtuous, more learned, more knowledgeable than Ahmed ibn Ḥanbal. Okay? In another narration, Ahmed ibn Ḥanbal, rahimahullah, he said Ahmed ibn Ḥanbal is an imam in 8 affairs, in 8 categories. He said he's an imam in hadith, an imam in fiqh, an imam in Arabic language, an imam in Quran, an imam in poverty, an imam in zuhd, right, referring to as suluk, an imam in piety, which is wara', cautious piety, an imam in sunnah. Right? Now you have to understand that the statements of such scholars is not something that they voluntarily give very lightly. Right? This is considered ta'deel. And when we make a statement like that, they hold themselves accountable for this. And so when they praise somebody, there's a reason why they're praising them, but they're also trying as much as they can to be accurate in that praise. Imam al-Maymuni, rahimahullah, he said, this last one I'm going to end with, he said, my eyes never saw anyone better than Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, and I have never seen anyone among the scholars of hadith who shows more respect of the sacred limits of Allah and the sunnah of His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If a report is proven to be sahih, and I have never seen anyone more keen to follow the footsteps of Rasulullah than him, radiallahu anhu. Now, when we talk about Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, his name usually never shows up unless it's associated with the great mihna, right? With the great mihna, which is the trial that happened. And I had alluded to this earlier, there's a reason he's called Imam Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, is because of that trial. And that trial has to do with when the Khalifa al-Ma'mun, he called people to consider the Quran to being created, right? So he had advisors that were from al-Mu'tazila, and they believed that the Quran, the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is created. But what al-Ma'mun had done is he actually trialed people, right? He would test them and he would force them to make that statement. And so he would bring many of the scholars and test them. Either he would jail them, imprison them, or torture them, whatever the case is. And many of the scholars either fled and they went into hiding. Others were forced under torture to admit and acknowledge and say that, the statement that he wanted to mention, And inshallah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them, because this was a necessity. They were under duress and compulsion to do something like this. Their life was threatened, and they were severely tortured. However, among the two scholars who hold their, they held their ground were Imām Aḥmad ibn Ḥanbal and Imām Muhammad ibn Nuh. Now, unfortunately, what happened was that Al-Ma'mun had requested that both of them be brought from Baghdad, and they were brought to Al-Ma'mun, but on the way, Al-Ma'mun had passed away. Okay? Al-Imam Muhammad ibn Nuh died. He was never made it back, but he advised Ahmed ibn Ḥanbal. He told him, he's like, you know your status, your position. If you do not hold your grounds, the sunnah will be lost. Right? The aqeedah of people will be deviated. And subhanAllah, Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, he took that to heart. When he told him, you're a man of a role model, people will listen to you. And subhanAllah, one of the things that was mentioned later on in one of the other khalifas, where he was telling him, Ya Ahmad, it's a word that you'd say, just say it, and you'd be out of here. And he said, what about those? So they had him in a pit, and the scholars of hadith were just waiting there for any word Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal would say. The minute he says makhluq, it's written and it's gone. That's it, done. But nonetheless, the whole gist of it is Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal was imprisoned. So Ma'mun had died. Unfortunately, his brother, right, Khalifa al-Mu'tasim, followed in the footsteps of his brother. And he also, tried to call Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal for it, tried to imprison him. And the Khalifa al-Wathiq, the same thing happened. And so it continued until al-Wathiq, or al-Mutawakkil, actually, al-Mutawakkil. Am I right? Al-Mutawakkil. Al-Khalifa al-Mutawakkil, right? He banned that opinion, and he freed Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal. Now that tribulation and trial lasted anywhere between 13 to 14 years, which Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal was banned from teaching. It didn't mean he didn't sometimes secretly teach people that came to his house, and he taught them. He still did that, including his own children, Abdullah and Salih. But after that, he took his position, Khalifa al-Mutawakkil, he was Imam of a Sunnah, and he stopped that statement, and he put back Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal in his position. In fact, he also wanted to gift Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal and elevate him in status due to what he has suffered, but Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal refused. Right? He would not accept any of that. Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, rahimahullah, he died in 12 Rabi' al-Awwal, in 1241, in Baghdad, and he was buried in Baghdad. It was mentioned that janazah was a janazah that was witnessed, and it was mentioned it was almost like 1 million people that witnessed his janazah. Some would say it included people from Ahl Kitab. Allah Alam how true that is, but at least we know many of the Muslims and scholars did walk in his janazah. Now, why I mention this is because we need to understand the background. And then Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, when we talk about his school of thought, I want you to understand that his school of thought is very comprehensive. Right? When we talk about his principles, but his fiqh, not just that, but also aqeedah and the Hanbali school of thought, we author our books based on the opinion of Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal. Right? And in essence, it is, I think, one of the, or if not the last, athari, right, considered athari or Ahl Hadith school remaining, right? Because we take our sunnahs from Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, from his masail and so forth. So whether it is fiqh, usul fiqh, or aqeedah, or even tazkiyah, right? Tazkiyah, which is, whether you want to call it tazkiyah, or call it tasawwuf, or suluk, we get that from Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal himself, right? And some of the most prominent scholars in the Hanbali school of madhhab that follow in the footsteps of Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal were, for example, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, rahimahullah, right? He was a Hanbali scholar, right? And so when I say we actually have our, very closed school, we have everything we need, we really have to go out, that is why, right? When we talk about, Imam Ahmad Ḥanbal was a master in language, we have that, right? In tafsir, we actually have our own Hanbali books of tafsir, most people don't know that, right? But anyway, if we're going to divide the development of the Hanbali school into stages, actually I'm not keeping track of time. Who's keeping track of time, Shaykh? 10 more minutes? طيب خير إن شاء الله. طيب, I'm going to go quickly through this, right? So we can divide the stage into 4 stages of development, right? So the first stage is the stage of establishment, and that starts from the, Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal himself, right? And, after the death of Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal. But we say from Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal until his death. So from 204 to 241, this is Imam Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, him, teaching, and his students writing down whatever they learned from him or his masail, right? So his opinions are being recorded, even though initially Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, rahimahullah, he forbade his opinions to be written, but later on some of his students convinced him to allow it, and this is how they gathered the Masā'il ibn Ḥanbal. The second stage is more of transmission and development, right? And that goes from 241 after the death of Ḥanbal to 403 of Hijrah. And these were the companions or the students of Ahmed ibn Ḥanbal. They actually propagated his fiqh. So they spread in different areas and they were teaching, right? They were lecturing based on what they learned from Imām Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal. And that way they kind of, the school kind of grew a little bit and kind of spread until one of the main people or students or scholars that period, Imam al-Khallal, rahimahullah, he actually went out. So he was a student of one of the students of Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal directly. But he traveled to all the students and gathered volumes of all the opinions of Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal. Didn't matter what it was, right? Tafsir, hadith, jarh, ta'dil, fiqh, made no difference, right? He gathered all of that into a compendium, like a huge volume, and this is how, a lot of it was established and kind of spread. But also affiliation with the Hanbali school started, kind of picking up a little bit. The principles of the school, if you talk about usul fiqh, the principles of school and its terminology began to be compiled in that first, or in that second stage, right? So this transmission and development. The third stage was considered more of the editing, verification, and review. That was from 403 to 884, where they would arrange the Masā'il of Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, right, into fiqh chapters, right? They would verify the general principles. They would extract secondary principles from this, right? So they would put the furu' of it. They would do takhrij, which is really important because this is what we use until this day, right? When we face something that the Hanbali scholars did not mention in their books, we do takhrij based on those things. So until this day, this happens. But the completion of the usul al-fiqh, right, happened in that time, and fiqh was given attention in all its differences and furu' and appearance of different layers of research and editors of the school happened, which transitions into the last stage, which is the settling and stability of the madhhab. This is where, the scholars started summarizing large volumes, writing, abridged versions of the text, researching, reviewing some, preferences, doing more takhrij on things that were there, academic efforts more among them. But this is until, until our present time, Wallahu a'lam. Now, if we want to talk about notable scholars, I'm going to divide this a bit differently based on just three categories, right? The earlier or the advanced, right, scholars, the earlier period, and then the middle period, and then later periods. So the earlier period, they would include the students of Imām Ahmad ibn Ḥanbal, right? So whether it's Abu Bakr al-Ajurri, rahimahullah, Imam al-Barbahari, Imam Abu Bakr al-Khallal, who gathered the book of the Sunnah, I mentioned earlier, Imam al-Karmani, rahimahullah, Imam Hani ibn Athram, which are some of the scholars there. Imam al-Khiraqi, if we want to know one of those people, Imam al-Khiraqi is important because he actually authored one of the first small abridged for books. It was called Mukhtasar Imam al-Khiraqi. Imam al-Warraq, rahimahullah, I want you to also remember him because he's a student of Al-Qadi Abi Ya'la, right, which comes to the middle stage, where some of those students included Al-Qadi Abi Ya'la, Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, Al-Wafaq ibn Aqil, Muwaffaq al-Din ibn Qudam al-Maqdisi. Ibn Qudam is a name you should remember, Ibn Qudam al-Maqdisi. The grandfather Ibn Taymiyyah, right? When we say Ibn Taymiyyah over here, we're referring to the grandfather. So he's Abu al-Barakat al-Majd ibn Taymiyyah. He is the grandfather. Now, Ibn Qudama and al-Majd ibn Taymiyyah, by the way, those two in that period were considered the authority. If they agree on something, that is it, right? And they authored books in fiqh in that time. Imam al-Tufi, rahimahullah, who is very prolific in usul al-fiqh. Imam ibn Muflih, rahimahullah, he has a very beautiful book in furu', but also in usul. Ibn Rajab al-Ḥanbalī, this is the name you guys should know, right? Some of them are most, if you study the 40 Nawawi, a lot of people know Ibn Rajab al-Ḥanbalī, rahimahullah. طيب, the last stage, where now a lot of the scholars, this is where they refer to in terms of the final books of usul, final books of fiqh. Some of the names I want you guys to remember is Imam Mansur al-Buhuti. All right, Imam Mansur al-Buhuti, rahimahullah. Imam Najjar al-Futuhi. Imam Safarini, rahimahullah. Imam Badr al-Din al-Dawmi. Imam al-Hajjawi, rahimahullah. And Imam Mardawi. All right, so these, if you want to enter, an entrance into the Hanbali school, those usually are the first books you're going to study. A lot of from these authors, and then you move up a little bit. طيب. Now, if you're talking about the usul madhhab ibn Hanbal, obviously there are four usul that every school agrees on. What are those four? Quick. I have 10 minutes. What is it? I hear mumbling. That's all I hear. You need a mic? Mic, Sheikh. Mic's not. No, I'm joking. What is it? Quran, Hadith, qiyas and ijma', okay? Those are the four, those are consistent. Now, the difference between the scholars happens because of what follows that, right? This is where the difference happened, but not just that, even if there's agreement between some of those among the scholars, but it's what the priority they give to some of those principles, especially if you have, for example, a hadith or a qiyas, if it contradicts, for example, a statement of the Sahabi. What do you pick, right? How do you arrange it? What comes first? This is also where they differ, right? And this is why sometimes they have, like, those different rulings that they come up with. Now, in addition to those, like, four that we mentioned, one of the important things in the Hanbali school of thought is the opinions or the fatwa of the companions. And I mean, like, they're really important to some extent, that if a qiyas is there and a fatwa of a sahabi goes against that qiyas, we're taking that fatwa of the sahabi, right? It's considered an evidence. And we leave that qiyas because the qiyas over here is more of a dhanni. You're deducing something from an origin where that, like, that sahabi has more knowledge and obviously more resources, and so we'll take the opinion of the sahabi rahimahullah, right? Another asl that we have is called al-istishab. Istishab, which is presumption of continuity, right? Which means that, like, it's a principle that presumes continuity of an existence, stance, or condition until it changes, okay? That is very important in terms of, for example, I'll give you a simple example, right? If you wake up in the morning and make wudu, right? And then you went about your day, you prayed your fajr, you went about your day, dhuhr time, you're like, did I break my wudu or not? Right? So what is the ruling? Do you have wudu or you don't? If you're a Maliki, who's Maliki here? Is any Malikis here? Any Shafi'is here? One? Alhamdulillah. Sudu Shafi'i, ya Shaykh. So the rest of you are Hanafis, mashallah. Why am I here? طيب. I'm going to convince you, inshallah. I'm going to walk with at least one, inshallah, converted Ḥanbalī today, inshallah. I'm going to try my best. No, I'm just joking. Wallah, all these madhhab, mashallah, there's khair in them, inshallah. But anyway, so if you're a Maliki, essentially you don't have wudu. But if you're a Ḥanbalī, for example, you would have wudu because the whole thing about the continuity, right? The whole thing about, you presumption of continuity, that unless you are sure you broke your wudu, you consider you have a wudu. Just giving you a simple example, right? One of the other principles is called sadd al-dhara'i', and hopefully I don't know if somebody mentioned it or not, but it's blocking of means, okay? And we tend to have issues with our beloved Ahnaf when it comes to, some of these things, right? Not that they're wrong, by the way, right? But we take a bit of a more of a protective stance about it. Of course, this is valid, and by the way, that position of the Hanafi opened a lot of gates for modern things, that if you take other opinions, it doesn't allow it. But sadd al-dhara'i' is something that is there, which is called blocking the means, right? It involves preventing actions that can lead to harmful, or prohibited outcomes, even if the means itself is not necessarily haram, right? And so it kind of blocks that off. The last one I'm going to mention is the istihsan, right? Istihsan, which is, I guess, is mentioned as juristic preference, but it's not what it sounds like, right? But usually in the Hanbali school of thought, where it comes in is because if you use qiyas, for example, you're supposed to come to a certain conclusion, but there's another form of evidence that the jurist sees that takes it away from that opinion to come to another opinion. That's what we call istihsan, okay? And I want you to be very cautious about using this word, because in different schools of thought, they use istihsan in a different way, and so sometimes they'll speak negatively about it, and sometimes they'll speak positively, but you have to address it in the way how each madhab looks at it, okay? Contributions in different areas. So we know definitely the Hanbali school of thought started in Baghdad, right? And it was a stronghold there. It actually shaped a lot of the opinions of the surrounding areas. A lot of the fatwas, some of the rules and regulations happened there in Baghdad, because that's where it started. But then after a while, that school, because of whether it is the other sects coming in, politics, whatever the reason, they ended up moving to Al-Maqdis. And one of the most famous houses in Al-Maqdis, Ibn Qudama's family, they held the torch of the Hanbali school. They were from Al-Maqdis, right? And many of the scholars of Al-Maqdis were from there. And historically, it was considered one of the Hanbali hubs there, until later on it moved to Ash-Sham, right, where it stayed. Now that being said, by the way, it didn't mean that there is no more scholars in those areas. That doesn't mean that. It just means the stronghold, where if you really want to learn a lot and meet a lot of Hanbali scholars, this is where you'd go. So it started from Baghdād, then to Al-Aqsa, and then to Ash-Sham. And then from there it moved to Egypt. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes, inshallah, talking about Egypt, because I'm from Egypt. No, I'm just joking, all right? But it did move to Egypt. And most people don't realize that Hanbali school of thought did move to Egypt. In fact, a lot of the latter scholars that came in, and many they relied upon books, were authored in Egypt. Imam Bahuti, rahimahullah, who is considered Sharih al-Madhhab, the one who explained the madhhab, like all they relied upon books, he has the best explanations. He was from Egypt. And Imam Mar'i al-Karmi, rahimahullah, he was from Egypt. Imam ibn Najjar al-Futuhi, he has one of the relied upon opinion texts of fiqh in Hanbali school, was from Egypt. And the reason behind that is because what was there? Al-Azhar, right? And so that's how it became the hub. Now, later on, the hub, obviously until this day, to some extent, it's more around the Arabian Peninsula, right? Not necessarily just Hijaz in Saudi Arabia, but also in areas of Qatar, areas of Kuwait, areas, all those things. It's more there, but once again, it doesn't mean that there are no Hanbali teachers in those areas. So subhanAllah, alhamdulillah, I was blessed to have one of my teachers is from Iraq, another one is from Syria. A lot of my teachers are from Egypt, and obviously I do have some from the Gulf area in Hijaz. I think I gathered all of these, alhamdulillah, it just happened, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send them for me. But they're still there. Now, I'm just gonna jump quickly because I only have a few minutes. In terms of how the principles of the Hanbali school are used until this day to deduce some of the modern rulings, right? And in fact, all the schools of thought are like that. It's kind of interesting. Some are more better suited in different fields than others. So it gives that leeway for other people to kind of seek fatwas in certain areas. Some more than others, wallahu alam. But for example, some of the contemporary things, that have to do with a lot of the financial transactions, right? For example, selling and buying without verbal transactions. In some schools of fiqh, buying and selling without verbal transactions is not considered valid, right? Shafi'is, okay? Which means that all Walmart, all Amazon, all our business transactions. No, nobody speaks to you now. You just scan it and you pay and you go, right? Or onto your WhatsApp. But they'll all be kind of invalid in some of the schools of thought. But in the Hanbali school of thought, it's not. It's considered valid, right? Wallahu alam. طيب, in terms of I'm going to mention one more thing. Selling what you have not possessed yet. Of course, provided that we're talking about certain things. In the Hanbali school of thought, there's certain things you have to possess first. But generally speaking, are you able to sell, right? Sell what you have bought before acquiring it or possessing it in your hands, okay? In the Hanbali school of thought, there's a lot of things you're allowed to do, right? Containing that. You don't have to, but once again, we divide them into different categories. Some things you have to acquire or possess, right? Such as, for example, if it had to do with crops or have to do certain things in a way that you're able to possess it. But other things, if you had bought it, you don't need to acquire it in your possession. You can just sell it to somebody else on the spot and tell them you can pick it up from there, right? A lot of modern business transactions, that happens a lot, right? Especially if you're talking about buying things from China and shipping it, and on the way half of it is already sold, right? Is that valid or not? In the Hanbali school of thought, a lot of that is valid. So these are some of the contemporary things. But what I want to end with is in the Hanbali school of thought, at least in my humble opinion, is what we can call a balanced flexibility, right? Because of how one of the dominant aspect of the Hanbali school of thought is when we talk about those principal thoughts, they're not weighed equally. So there's heavy emphasis. There's Hanbali school is very textual, right? In its origin, and it will stick a lot to the text if it's there. But the Hanbali school maintains a very balanced balance between strict adherence to the text, but also practical flexibility, right? The flexibility comes from the usul, some of the usul that I had mentioned, such as istihsan, right? Or sometimes the istishab. Some will include the masalih al-mursala. That is not used much in the madhab. It's used very slightly, but it's still there, right? So it's those other things that give the school of thought flexibility and adaptation to complex situation, ensuring that the legal Hanbali framework is still valid no matter what time or region it is, right? And I will stop it at there because obviously you can always use qiyas, you can always use the things, but I just wanted to mention some of the things that have not been mentioned by other schools. And we'll stop here, inshallah. And I think we'll take questions. I saw Sheikh